Daniel was born into a world of hardship. His parents, Rosa and Joachim, had come from a long line of sharecroppers, barely scraping by on the meager earnings from their small patch of land. They lived in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of a town that had long forgotten them. The townspeople, mostly white and well-off, looked down on the poor black families who lived on the edges of society, seeing them as nothing more than a burden. From a young age, Daniel was taught that life was about survival. There was no time for dreams or aspirations. Every day was a battle to keep food on the table. His parents were hardened by their circumstances, and though they cared for Daniel in their own way, they often expressed their frustrations through harsh words and cold indifference. As a child, Daniel spent most of his time working in the fields with his parents. The sun was relentless, and the work was exhausting. While other children in the town went to school, played in the streets, and enjoyed their childhoods, Daniel's life was a constant grind. His hands were calloused by the age of 10, his back sore from the long hours of labor. The few times he did attend school, he was teased by the other children for his ragged clothes and worn-out shoes. Their taunts stung, but he quickly learned to keep his head down and say nothing. At home, things weren't much better. Joachim, his father, was a stern man who believed that showing affection was a sign of weakness. He rarely spoke to Daniel except to give orders or express his disappointment. Rosa, his mother, was often too tired to offer any comfort, her energy drained by the endless cycle of work and worry. Daniel's siblings, older and just as beaten down by life, avoided him, seeing him as another mouth to feed rather than a brother to care for. Despite the harshness of his surroundings, Daniel was a sensitive soul. He longed for love and acceptance, for someone to see him as more than just a burden. He found solace in the quiet moments he spent alone, lying in the grass and staring up at the sky, dreaming of a different life. He imagined a world where he was free from the chains of poverty, where he could walk down the street with his head held high, respected and valued for who he was. But as the years passed, those dreams seemed more and more distant. The reality of his situation weighed heavily on him, and the bitterness that surrounded him began to seep into his soul. He resented his family for their coldness, for their inability to see him as anything more than a failure. And deep down, he feared they were right, that he was destined to be nothing more than a poor, forgotten man, just like his father. Part 2. A Chance Encounter. One hot summer day, when Daniel was in his early 20s, everything changed. He had been working in the field since dawn, his body aching from the unrelenting toil. As the sun reached its peak, he decided to take a break and seek some shade. He walked to the edge of the field, where an old, abandoned building stood. It had been part of a larger estate many years ago, but now it was little more than a crumbling ruin. Daniel had always been curious about the building, but his father had warned him to stay away, saying it was dangerous and haunted by the past. But on this day, his curiosity got the better of him. He approached the building cautiously, his heart beating faster with each step. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were shattered, but something about the place drew him in. Inside, the air was cool and damp, a welcome relief from the scorching heat outside. The floors were covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. As Daniel explored the rooms, he noticed a small, locked chest in the corner of what must have once been the living room. The lock was old and rusted, and with a little effort, he was able to pry it open. Inside the chest was a collection of old papers, yellowed with age. Most of them were letters and documents that had long since lost their significance, but one piece of paper caught Daniel's eye. It was a deed, dating back nearly a century, to a large parcel of land that included a mine. The name on the deed was unfamiliar to him, but the location was clear. It was the land right under his feet. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the paper. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. If this document was legitimate, it meant that he was standing on a piece of property that had once been incredibly valuable. His mind raced with possibilities. Could the mine still be there? Could it be filled with untold riches, just waiting to be discovered? The thought seemed too fantastical to be true, but Daniel knew he had to find out. Over the next few days, he returned to the building every chance he got, digging through the rubble and searching for any sign of the mine. Finally, after days of searching, he found it, a hidden entrance in the basement, covered by debris. His heart pounded as he uncovered the entrance, revealing a dark tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. With nothing but a flashlight and his determination, Daniel ventured into the tunnel. The air was thick and musty, and the walls were lined with wooden beams that creaked under the weight of the earth above. As he ventured deeper, the tunnel opened up into a large cavern, and there, glittering in the dim light, were veins of gold embedded in the rock. Daniel could hardly believe his eyes. He had found it, the gold mine that had been lost for generations. The wealth before him was unimaginable, far beyond anything he had ever dared to dream of. He knew that this discovery would change his life forever. Daniel's discovery was just the beginning. He knew he needed help to extract the gold and turn it into money, so he reached out to a mining company in the nearest city. They were skeptical at first, but when Daniel showed them the samples he had collected, they quickly realized the potential of the mine. Within weeks, they had set up operations, and the gold began to flow. The company offered Daniel a deal that made him an instant millionaire. He now had more money than he had ever imagined, enough to lift him out of poverty and change his life forever. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerful and in control of his destiny. With his newfound wealth, Daniel moved to the city, leaving behind the small town that had been the source of so much pain. He bought a luxurious apartment, new clothes, and everything he had ever wanted. He no longer had to worry about where his next meal would come from or how he would pay his bills. He was finally free. As word of Daniel's wealth spread, his family began to take notice. They had treated him with indifference for years, but now they saw him in a new light. His parents, once so cold and distant, reached out to him, expressing their pride in his success. His siblings, who had ignored him for most of his life, suddenly wanted to reconnect, eager to share in his good fortune. At first, Daniel was hesitant. He remembered all the years of neglect and hurt, the way they had treated him as if he were nothing. But deep down, he had always longed for their acceptance, for a family that loved and respected him. And now, with his newfound wealth and status, he finally had the power to make that happen. Daniel decided to give his family a second chance. He invited them to his new home in the city, where they marveled at the luxury he had surrounded himself with. His parents were in awe, their once stern faces softened by the realization that their son had become a success. His siblings, too, were eager to please, showering him with compliments and praise. For a time, it seemed as though everything was perfect. Daniel had finally gained the acceptance he had always craved, and his family was now proud of him in a way they had never been before. But as the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to realize that something was still missing. Part 4. The Empty Victory. As much as Daniel enjoyed his new life, there was a hollowness that he couldn't shake. His family's sudden change in attitude felt too convenient, too calculated. He couldn't help but wonder if they truly cared for him, or if they were just interested in his money. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that their acceptance was conditional, based on his wealth rather than on who he was as a person. Daniel tried to ignore these feelings, to convince himself that everything was fine. He threw lavish parties, surrounded himself with new friends, and indulged in every luxury money could buy. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. One evening, after a particularly extravagant party, Daniel found himself alone in his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, but they did little to lift the heaviness in his heart. He realized then that despite all the wealth and success he had gained, he was still the same person he had always been, someone searching for love and acceptance. The next day, Daniel made a decision. He would confront his family and demand the truth. He invited them over for dinner, and as they sat around the table, he finally spoke up. "Why are you really here?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Is it because you love me, or because I'm rich?" His parents exchanged uneasy glances, and his siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel could see the guilt in their eyes, and in that moment, he knew the answer. They had come back into his life not because they had changed, but because they saw an opportunity to benefit from his success. "I've spent my whole life trying to earn your love and respect," Daniel continued, his voice trembling with the weight of years of hurt. "But I realize now that I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval to know my worth." His words hung in the air, heavy with the truth they carried. His family, for the first time, seemed to truly see him, not as a failure or as a source of wealth, but as a man who had found his own strength and self-worth. In the days that followed, Daniel made some difficult decisions. He chose to distance himself from his family, not out of anger, but out of a desire to protect his newfound sense of self. He continued to support them financially, but he set boundaries, making it clear that his wealth was not something to be taken for granted. Daniel also began to reevaluate his life. He realized that true happiness didn't come from material wealth, but from the connections and relationships that were built on mutual respect and love. He started volunteering in the community, giving back to those who were still struggling, just as he had once struggled. He found fulfillment in helping others, in being a source of hope and inspiration. Over time, Daniel built a new family, a family of friends and community members who valued him for who he was, not for what he had. He found love with a woman who saw him not as a rich man, but as a kind and generous soul. Together, they created a life filled with purpose and joy, a life that was rich in the ways that truly mattered. Part 5. The True Legacy. Years passed, and Daniel's story became well known in the city. He was no longer just the poor boy who had struck it rich, but a man who had used his wealth to make a difference in the lives of others. His legacy was not the gold he had discovered, but the impact he had on his community and the love he had given and received. Daniel's parents, now elderly, came to realize the error of their ways. They saw the man their son had become and regretted the years they had wasted pushing him away. In their final years, they reached out to Daniel, not for money or status, but for the chance to make amends. Daniel, ever kind and forgiving, welcomed them back into his life, but this time, it was on his terms. In the end, Daniel learned that true wealth wasn't about money or material possessions. It was about the relationships you build, the lives you touch, and the love you share. He had started with nothing, but he had gained everything that truly mattered. And so, Daniel lived the rest of his days surrounded by love, respect, and a deep sense of fulfillment. He had found his place in the world, not because of a piece of paper or a mind filled with gold, but because he had discovered the true value of himself and the people around him. His story became a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that no matter where you start in life, you have the power to shape your own destiny. Moral of the story. This story emphasizes the importance of self-worth and the realization that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the quality of our relationships and the impact we have on others. It also highlights the idea that while family and acceptance are important, they must be built on genuine love and respect, not on superficial measures of success. Daniel's journey from poverty to wealth, and ultimately to self-discovery, serves as a powerful reminder that our true legacy is not what we accumulate, but how we use what we have to make a difference in the world.